Everett Wallace stood in the doorway of his modest bookstore, sunlit dust motes dancing on the well-worn hardwood floors, the faint smell of old paper drifting amid shelves stacked high with novels, biographies, and local histories. At 66, he still possessed the upright bearing of a man who had served in the military long ago, though his hair had turned a soft pewter and deep lines creased the edges of his eyes. For nearly 4 decades he'd sold literature, stationery, and a sense of community in Brackenport, a town bordered by distant hills and a narrow river that glimmered at sunset. He had returned from the Gulf War decades ago with a slight limp and a fierce determination to build a life untouched by fear or compromise. It was that determination that made him open the Lighthouse Bookstore on a quiet corner where the crows cawed each morning, a place of comfort, he liked to say, for minds eager to learn. Over the years, Brackenport had known quiet prosperity, family-owned shops, friendly neighbors, local farmers selling fresh produce at the weekend market, but the last few years had brought an unsettling shift. People whispered about the new local leadership, about rising fees, about how the new police chief didn't answer to justice so much as line his own pockets. Everett had heard the rumors of petty officials tightening their grip. He'd watched as neighboring businesses either quietly paid or mysteriously shuttered. Still, a stubborn pride stopped him from bowing to intimidation. Perhaps it was a relic of his army days, that conviction that surrender emboldened bullies far more than resistance invited danger. He prided himself on his unshakable honesty, and now he feared that honesty placed him directly in a storm that threatened everything he'd built. One mild afternoon, Everett was ringing up a customer, a local teacher buying a classic novel to inspire her students, when he glanced up to see 3 uniformed officers entering. The tallest, Captain Roma Allen, walked in first, lips curled in a smug half-smile. Behind her, Officers Whitaker and Montoya flanked in cautious formation. Their presence sent a ripple of tension through the few customers browsing among the shelves. One older woman left without completing her purchase, practically fleeing out the front door. Everett's heart thudded, but he smiled politely. "Afternoon, officers. Can I help you find anything?" Roma Allen stepped closer to the counter, idly running her fingertips along a hardcover biography of a civil rights icon. She feigned interest in the dust jacket before meeting Everett's eyes with a dismissive sweep of her gaze. "Nice shop, Mr. Wallace," she said, in a tone that dripped with cold amusement. "You've had it for what, 30+ years?" 38, Everett replied calmly. 38 years is a long time to run a bookstore in Brackenport, Allen mused. Things change, though. Regulations, property taxes, cost of doing business. Don't you feel it getting heavier these days? She flipped open the biography as though scanning it for contraband. Everett had heard of them, suspected of taking bribes, rumored to have arrangements with any store owners who wanted to avoid trouble. "I manage," Everett said. "I've got my business license, fire inspection, everything else up to date. Paperwork is in order if you'd like to see it." Allen's eyes gleamed. "That's wonderful. Still, a place like this, a single spark could burn it to ash. Books are flammable after all." Everett felt a tightening in his chest. He thought of his daughter Talia, miles away on some classified assignment. Talia Wallace, once the bright-eyed child who wrote stories in a notebook, was now Colonel Talia Spector Wallace, of the Army's elite Special Operations Forces. She'd told her father that if anything went wrong, if bullies came knocking, all it took was one phone call. But Everett had always wanted to handle his own battles. He exhaled and squared his shoulders, refusing to let intimidation overwhelm him. "I trust our local fire department would respond promptly," he said quietly. Allen smirked. "Well, that depends, Mr. Wallace. Emergencies require resources. Meanwhile, the city is strapped for funds. We're providing an opportunity to help local businesses stay safe. For a modest monthly donation, we can ensure faster response times, more patrols around your block. Just $500 a month." Everett stared at her, anger twisting in his gut. That sounds an awful lot like a protection racket. Montoya stepped forward, hand brushing the hilt of his holstered weapon. His gaze flickered to the store's exit, assessing possible witnesses. Whitaker hovered by a rotating display of bookmarks, scowling. Allen's forced politeness slipped, replaced by a predatory edge. "I'd be careful with that word, Mr. Wallace. We are sworn officers of the law. Accusations like that could count as slander." Everett refused to be cowed. "I served this country overseas, Captain Allen. I know exactly what corruption looks like." Allen's jaw tightened, the corners of her eyes crinkling with cold fury. "Is that right? You fought in the Gulf, I hear. Must have been some tough days." "I've seen tougher," Everett said, refusing to break eye contact. In the tense silence, one of the overhead lights buzzed softly. The last remaining customer slipped out the door, evidently not wanting to be caught in the crossfire of stares. "Then maybe you've learned how to pick your battles," Allen remarked. "Because this town can become a dangerous place for folks who say the wrong things to the wrong people." Everett felt a flicker of defiance so strong it nearly choked him. "What's truly dangerous," he said, voice low, "is letting fear rule. I'm not paying you a single dime." Allen's face darkened as though she'd expected him to fold. She leaned in slightly, using her height to loom over him. "That's your choice. Just don't complain later when you find out how rough Brackenport can get. So many accidents, sparks, break-ins, you name it." Everett clenched his jaw. "Get out of my store unless you plan to buy a book." For a moment it seemed the tension in the air might erupt into violence. Then Allen slowly backed away. She slid the biography back on the shelf with an exaggerated care that felt more threatening than careless. Her two companions followed, silent but scowling. "You might reconsider," she said at the threshold. "I'd hate to see a beloved local business meet an untimely end." They left. The door shut with a jingle of the bell. Everett stood behind the counter, heart pounding like artillery in his ears. He forced himself to breathe. War had taught him that sometimes the worst terror wasn't an open battlefield, but the slow creep of corruption in one's own backyard. He knew with a grim certainty that this was just the beginning. Yet he refused to kneel to threats. That night, as he closed the shop, a swirl of sunset gold tinted the windows. He methodically checked the locks, installed extra latches, and made sure the fire extinguisher was easily accessible. The idea that they would try to set his bookstore ablaze filled him with both dread and anger. But fear wouldn't rule him. He drove home through quiet streets, unsettled by how empty they felt. Brackenport used to bustle, especially near the waterfront, but it seemed that nowadays many people holed up indoors to avoid trouble. His modest house, a single-story bungalow, was dark when he arrived. He warmed up leftover stew, ate mechanically, and stared at his phone. Should he call Talia? Pride and worry waged a silent battle in his mind. Finally, he told himself that it hadn't escalated far enough yet. He wouldn't drag Talia from her duties for some petty shakedown. He'd stand strong. The next morning, Everett woke early, determined to check the shop before dawn. His stomach knotted when he turned onto his street and saw shards of broken glass glittering on the sidewalk under a flickering street lamp. Panicking, he parked in front of the Lighthouse Bookstore. Every window was smashed. Spray paint scrawled along the walls. "Mind your business. Stay quiet." Menacing messages that made his blood boil. He rushed inside to find the interior ransacked. Shelves overturned, books torn and scattered, the small cafe station trashed. In the middle of the floor lay a dead raccoon, a grotesque note pinned to its fur. "Next time it's you." He felt something inside him fracture at the sight of precious books, many of them rare editions he'd curated over years lying in ruin. But the fury at this injustice dwarfed any despair. Hands shaking, he pulled out his phone to document everything. Pictures, videos, evidence of vandalism. He called the local precinct to file a report, though he suspected it would do no good. Then he contacted his insurance agency, who promised an adjuster but warned it might be days. Meanwhile, his bookstore sat in shambles, windows gaping like wounds. By 9 a.m., a certain Inspector Dalrymple arrived, thin, hawk-nosed, with a sneer that reminded Everett of a weasel. Dalrymple was from the city's Department of Health and Safety. He wandered the destroyed store with a clipboard, making tisking noises. "What a disaster," Dalrymple intoned. "Broken glass, potential hazards, possibly mold from all these ruined books. I'll have to cite you for unsafe conditions." Everett stared at the man in disbelief. "I'm the victim of vandalism. How is that my fault?" Dalrymple shrugged. "Regulations are regulations. I'll be issuing a closure notice until these violations are addressed. You can't open to the public with the premises in this condition." Fury leapt in Everett's throat, but he reminded himself not to lose control. That was exactly what these people wanted, an outburst they could twist into assault or disorderly conduct. He forced a measured tone. "I'll fix it." "See that you do," Dalrymple said, scribbling on his form. "Until then, you're shut down, and if you decide to operate despite this order, we'll have to take enforcement action." Everett's shoulders slumped under the weight of injustice. They were pushing him, trying to break him financially, psychologically, yet he wouldn't yield. It might have been safer to give them the money, but he couldn't do it. As he stared at the damage, he recalled the vow he'd made to himself in uniform all those years ago. Never bow to fear. He decided to go to the police station anyway, to create a record of the vandalism. Paper trails mattered, even if the local cops were crooked. Upon entering the station's worn lobby, he found Captain Allen waiting, as though she'd predicted his arrival. She stood leaning against the front desk, arms crossed, an amused twist to her lips. "Back so soon, Mr. Wallace," she drawled. "Let me guess, you want to file a complaint about some petty damage?" Everett clenched his jaw. "My shop was destroyed last night. I'd like a formal report filed." Allen pretended to check a small notepad. "Didn't see any calls come in. Are you sure you dialed the right department?" He felt his temper rising, but fought to keep his voice even. "I spoke to a dispatcher. They said they'd note it." Allen gave him a cold, predatory smile. "That's interesting because there's no record in our system. Maybe your phone call was accidentally lost. Things happen." Everett took a breath, his fists balled at his sides. "Then let's do it now." Allen's smirk vanished, replaced by a menacing glint. "Or we can do this another way. Disturbing the peace, interfering with an officer, maybe even making unfounded accusations of corruption. How about that, old man?" Before Everett could protest, two officers behind him grabbed his arms, wrenching them behind his back. He felt the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around his wrists. Allen raised her voice theatrically. "Everett Wallace, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct, threatening an officer, and resisting lawful commands. You have the right to remain silent." None of the other cops in the station batted an eye. They either approved or were too scared to intervene. Everett tried to suppress the roiling anger in his chest as they marched him through booking. They took his fingerprints, snapped a mugshot that captured the indignation in his eyes. Then he was unceremoniously tossed into a holding cell with chipped paint and a lingering odor of stale sweat. Alone on the hard bench, he let out a shaky breath. He recalled the faces of fellow soldiers he'd lost overseas, men and women who believed they were protecting the ideals of their homeland. Now, ironically, he was behind bars for refusing to yield to domestic bullies. Hours crawled by. Finally, a gaunt officer with regret in his eyes approached the bars. "You get one phone call," he said quietly. Everett nodded. This time his pride wouldn't hold him back. He dialed the number Talia had given him years ago. It rang 3 times before it connected, the line encrypted and humming with electronic hush. "Dad?" came Talia's voice. He heard the tension, the readiness, as though she sensed something was wrong the moment she answered. "Talia, honey," he began, feeling a wave of shame that he was calling from a cell. "I'm in trouble. Corrupt police. They're trying to extort me. My store's destroyed. I can't do this alone." A brief pause. Then Talia spoke again, voice dropping into a calm, lethal register he recognized from her hush-hush missions. "Where are you, Dad? Tell me everything." He explained the intimidation, the vandalism, the arrest on trumped-up charges. He felt her controlled fury even through the phone like a cold spike of steel. "I'll handle it," Talia said softly. "Just hold on. And Dad? Don't worry about the bookstore. They don't know what fear really means." Then she hung up, leaving Everett to wonder if he'd unleashed a maelstrom that would tear Brackenport's corruption wide open. A small, grim part of him felt a flicker of satisfaction. Sometimes justice needed someone who understood how to fight monsters without flinching. He dozed in the cell, recalling Talia's childhood, how she'd devoured books from his shelves, the spark in her eye whenever she learned something new. She'd joined the military to serve, to stand for principles he'd taught her. Now, ironically, she was returning to defend him from wolves in uniforms. After a few hours, an exasperated desk sergeant opened the cell door. "Wallace, you're free to go. Charges dropped." "Why?" Everett asked, though he guessed the answer. "Don't ask me," the sergeant muttered, avoiding his gaze. "Orders from above." Everett retrieved his personal effects at the front desk, stepping into the station's lobby with his shoulders set. There, leaning against the far wall, was Talia. She wore civilian clothes, yet her posture betrayed the soldier within. Mid-30s, tall, athletic, her hair in a tight braid, and a calm, piercing gaze that could freeze a man in his tracks. The moment she saw her father, her face softened into a concerned frown. "Dad," she strode forward and embraced him. He closed his eyes, relief and gratitude flooding his chest. When they pulled apart, Talia's expression was all business. "You all right?" He nodded, though his dignity felt battered. "Nothing I can't handle," Talia gave a curt nod. "Then let me do my part." Because they've crossed the line. They walked out together, ignoring the hostile stares of officers behind them. Just as they exited, Captain Allen stepped out of a hallway, eyes wide, posture stiffening. Talia turned slightly and locked eyes with her, offering a grim, promising smile that sent an unmistakable shudder through Allen's posture. Outside, the morning sun felt warm, a reminder that the world still turned. Talia guided Everett to a rented SUV parked discreetly across the street. As he buckled in, she tapped out messages on a secure phone, speaking quietly into an earpiece. Everett tried not to intrude on her business, but he caught phrases like satellite recon, DOJ liaison, and internal infiltration. She ended the call and turned to him. "I've got contacts who can help," she said. "But first I need to see your bookstore." A few minutes later, they stood in the wreckage of the Lighthouse Bookstore. Talia's jaw clenched as she surveyed the graffiti, the torn pages, the shattered glass. She ran her gloved fingers over the dried blood on the floor, where the dead raccoon had been left as a threat. She inhaled slowly, a warrior's composure settling over her. "They'll regret this." Everett swallowed. "Talia, I don't want you in danger. This is my fight." Her eyes locked on his. "You taught me never to walk away from bullies, Dad, especially when they hurt the people we love. Let me handle it." Everett wanted to protest further, but realized he couldn't. One look at the silent fury in her gaze told him that no power on earth would stop her from righting this wrong, so he exhaled and mustered a calm voice. "All right, but be careful." Talia gave a small nod. "Always." That evening, news spread through the precinct that a certain Colonel Talia Wallace, Delta Force with rumored high-level connections, had come to town. Rumors sparked like dry tinder. Some officers quietly removed personal belongings from their desks, fearing an impending federal sweep. Others doubled down, shredding documents, erasing logs. Captain Allen tried to call in every favor she had, but the bigger fish in Brackenport's political system were uneasy. They'd heard whispered tales of Talia Spector Wallace, stories of entire insurgent cells dismantled overseas, of black ops missions with zero casualties on her side. A ghost, a living legend. Allen confronted the chief, Gerald Rowan, in his austere office. An older man with iron-gray hair and a permanent scowl, Rowan had built a web of corruption over 15 years. He'd orchestrated hush payments, manipulated city council members, allowed gangs to flourish if they paid the right price. Now the sudden presence of Talia Wallace threatened to unravel it all. "We need to shut this down," Allen said, tension clear in her voice. "Otherwise half the force might flip if federal investigators show up." Rowan frowned. "It's just one soldier, Captain. We have an entire department." "You haven't read her file," Allen shot back. "She's not just any soldier. She has federal connections, maybe even black ops. This could bring the FBI, DEA, everyone sniffing around." Rowan's grip tightened on his pen. "Then we destroy evidence. Every file, every body cam, everything. And keep an eye on Everett Wallace and his daughter. Make their lives miserable until they're forced out. If they won't leave, we give them an accident." Allen nodded. "I'll round up the loyal officers. Meanwhile, we might need outside help, someone who can handle, well, special operations of our own." Thus began a frantic scramble of shredding documents, wiping computers, forging new reports. They moved swiftly, but Talia and her allies moved faster. At a makeshift command center in a vacant warehouse, Talia coordinated with old acquaintances, a data specialist named Lieutenant Chiang from Army Intelligence, an investigative journalist named Dina Park, and a handful of honest local citizens outraged by the corruption. They pooled resources, hacking into city servers, capturing deleted files, building an unstoppable case. Meanwhile, Talia's presence in Brackenport served as psychological warfare all on its own. She made no effort to hide that she was gathering intel, letting the city's crooked officials stew in anxiety. She'd stand silently at the edge of city council meetings, phone in hand, capturing every suspicious moment. Rumors flew that she had a direct hotline to the Department of Justice. Some of that rumor was even true. During one crisp afternoon, Talia paid a visit to the local mayor, Gunnar Eastman, a stout man with a perpetually false grin. She walked straight into City Hall, ignoring the wide-eyed receptionist who stammered about appointments. She found Eastman in his plush corner office examining a ledger. He jumped when she entered unannounced. "Miss Wallace, Colonel, I don't believe we had a meeting set." Talia folded her arms. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Mayor Eastman." He swallowed, sweat beading on his forehead. "What can I do for you?" Her voice was soft but lethal. "I suggest you consider cooperating when the feds come knocking, because they're coming, and soon. Anyone who tries to obstruct them will face consequences." Eastman's eyes darted. I don't know what you've heard, Colonel, but we run a clean town." Talia lifted a brow. "Then you have nothing to worry about, right?" She didn't bother to wait for a response. She turned and left, letting the silence ring. Eastman sagged in his seat, hastily dialing a number he rarely used, pleading for assistance from shadowy contacts. But word had spread that Colonel Wallace was in town, and certain high-level backers, powerful interests who quietly financed Brackenport's corruption, were beginning to wonder if the risk was too great. They hinted to Eastman that he should handle this swiftly or he'd lose their support. That same day, Everett reopened his bookstore in defiance of the closure notice, determined to salvage what he could. Neighbors arrived with broomsticks and garbage bags, helping him clean. Broken windows were boarded up temporarily, and local donors chipped in for repairs. A sense of solidarity blossomed among the good people of Brackenport, who had grown weary of intimidation. In hushed voices, folks thanked Everett for standing up, for reminding them that fear didn't have to rule their lives. Talia watched from across the street, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. She knew intimidation would escalate. Sure enough, that evening, a pair of suspicious cars idled outside the bookstore, men inside snapping photos with telephoto lenses. Talia discreetly photographed them in return, memorizing license plates. She arranged for a small drone overhead, capturing every angle. She wanted to be sure no one fired a single bullet or tossed a Molotov cocktail without being recorded. Early next morning, one of Talia's contacts in a federal office tipped her off. "There's a contract out for you," the contact said. Someone hired outside mercenaries, likely ex-military from overseas, to remove an obstacle. "That's you, Colonel." Talia calmly thanked them. She'd dealt with worse. But to protect her father, she quietly moved him to an undisclosed safe apartment with reinforced doors and cameras. She told him it was just short-term precaution, though she saw the flicker of anxiety in his eyes. This was not how Everett wanted to live, hidden away. Yet she insisted, and he relented, trusting her instincts. Then Talia set her trap. She deliberately allowed rumors to spread that she was staying at her father's house alone. She kept the lights on in his bungalow, a silhouette in the window, one of her team members wearing Talia's hoodie. Meanwhile, Talia and 2 retired Army comrades staked out the perimeter. They utilized night vision optics, perimeter motion sensors, everything that would turn the quiet block into a fortress. Just after midnight, 2 unmarked vans rolled silently into the neighborhood, headlights off. Talia tensed from her vantage point behind a neighbor's garage. Her earpiece crackled with a whisper from her friend, Sergeant Paxton. Movement on the west side, 4 men, assault gear. She exhaled slowly. Let them come. With practiced efficiency, the mercenaries approached the bungalow, cutting the power lines in an attempt to blind security cameras. But Talia had installed battery backups and hidden cameras with heat sensors. She tracked every step they took. One mercenary tried to pick the lock on the back door. The moment it clicked, Talia and Paxton moved in quietly, incapacitating the first 2 with swift strikes to the back of their necks. The second pair realized too late they were cornered. One fired suppressed shots into the shadows, muzzle flashes giving away his location. Talia ghosted around him, disarmed him with a well-placed kick, and pinned him to the ground in a chokehold. The final mercenary tried to flee. He never made it past Paxton's silent takedown. By the time local police, honest ones, coordinated by Talia's ally on the force, arrived, the mercenaries were bound and unconscious. It was almost anticlimactic. These men, presumably skilled and dangerous, had been undone by Talia's perfect planning and years of special ops experience. Captain Allen, roused from bed at 2 a.m, arrived at the scene, shock clear on her face. "What the? Colonel Wallace, you're operating a sting in my jurisdiction?" Talia calmly met her gaze. "Just defending myself from hitmen your department apparently let slip into town." Allen clenched her teeth. "We had no information on this." Talia offered a cold half-smile. "Maybe you weren't looking, or maybe you were busy shredding documents." Behind them, the handcuffed mercenaries were loaded into squad cars, though Talia had already captured all the intel she needed. Phone logs, text messages on their devices, a chain of communications leading back to shadowy figures in city government. The next morning, news of the attempted hit squad spread like wildfire through Brackenport. People whispered in coffee shops and gas stations that Colonel Wallace had taken down 4 armed professionals by herself. Fear shifted from the townsfolk to the corrupt officials who now realized they were in over their heads. The mayor, the chief of police, all of them recognized that Talia Wallace was beyond their usual intimidation tactics. They were cornered animals, and cornered animals could lash out violently. Meanwhile, Talia's network passed the mercenaries' phones to a federal cyber unit. Within hours, the data specialist traced calls to an offshore account belonging to a shell corporation, rumored to funnel money into Brackenport city funds, another link in the chain. At the bookstore, Everett, trying to maintain normalcy, was greeted by a stream of supportive neighbors. They bought books even if they didn't need any, leaving encouraging notes. Reporters from outside Brackenport began trickling in, intrigued by the story of a war veteran father and his Delta Force daughter standing against a corrupt power structure. Everett felt overwhelmed by the attention, but if it helped bring the truth to light, he wouldn't complain. Talia, however, disliked the media presence. She preferred working in the shadows. Still, she recognized the strategic advantage. Public scrutiny would make the corrupt side cautious about overt violence. At least that was the hope, but she had seen desperate men do desperate things before. One afternoon, Talia visited the station alone again. She walked straight to Chief Rowan's office, ignoring the flustered desk sergeant who tried to stop her. Rowan, glowering behind his desk, had 2 officers standing by, likely muscle in case Talia tried anything. She showed no fear, her voice calm. "Chief Rowan, she said. Let's skip the pleasantries. I have evidence tying you to extortion and attempted murder. I strongly suggest you cooperate with federal investigators. Possibly they'll cut you a deal. Rowan kept his face stoic, though a tremor passed through his jaw. You can't come in here making demands. You have no jurisdiction. Talia arched a brow. I have enough to bring in real jurisdiction. FBI, DOJ, pick your acronym. They'll swarm this department, seize files, question every officer. Some will flip on you to save their own hides. Rowan's cheek twitched. Get out. She studied him for a beat. You should know. My father's not leaving Brackenport. You so much as touch a hair on his head and every Fed in a 1,000-mile radius descends on you. With that, she turned and strode out. In the hush that followed, Rowan slammed a fist on his desk. We need to neutralize her, he hissed to Allen, who hovered in the corner. Call in bigger reinforcements. City Hall can't protect us forever if this becomes a national story. Allen swallowed, remembering the small army Talia had bested. Bigger reinforcements? From where? Rowan's eyes narrowed. Let me worry about that. He picked up a phone connected to contacts he'd rarely called, because if Talia had federal connections, he needed an organization that operated in darker corners of the underworld. Meanwhile, Talia had her father moved again, aware that each day they stayed was a ticking clock. Around the same time, a local journalist, Harrison Reed, who had been quietly investigating Brackenport's corruption for months, approached Everett at the bookstore. Reed was middle-aged, with a gentle demeanor and a sincere desire to see justice served. He offered to run a series of articles that exposed the network of bribes, threats, and laundering. Mr. Wallace, Reed began, voice earnest, people need to see the truth. Some of them suspect it, but they're afraid. If we publish real evidence, we can't be ignored. Everett glanced at Talia, who nodded. We have plenty of evidence, Talia said, but we need to be sure you're safe once it goes public. Reed lifted his shoulders. This is worth it. For years I've watched my hometown slip into fear. I'm ready to shine a light. Within 24 hours, Talia's network provided Reed with documents, recordings, and high-definition videos of payoffs and intimidation. The plan was to release it incrementally, each revelation fueling further scrutiny from outside law enforcement. They gave Rowan and his cronies every chance to surrender, but desperation often spawns the worst violence. Late one night, Everett was in the safe apartment, half asleep, when Talia's phone rang. She answered, listened, then muttered a curse under her breath. They've set up a blockade around City Hall, she told him. Word is the mayor plans to stage a crisis to distract the media, some kind of hostage situation. They figure if everything's chaotic, the feds will back off. Everett's eyes widened. That's insane. Desperate men do insane things, Talia said gravely. I'm going in. He grasped her wrist. No, they'll shoot on sight. She gave him a reassuring squeeze. I've handled worse, trust me. Heart heavy, he nodded. She was unstoppable when she believed in a cause. As she left, he whispered, Be safe, Talia. Please. She offered a small, fierce smile. Semper Fi, though that's more of a Marine motto. Let's just say I'll always come back. And then she was gone, stepping into the swirling night. Downtown, the mayor and Chief Rowan barricaded City Hall with loyal officers and newly hired guns. The flickering strobe of emergency lights lit up the facade. A frantic call had gone out that unknown terrorists threatened the building, but Talia knew it was a cover story. She arrived in a black SUV, accompanied by Sergeant Paxton, Dina Park, the journalist, and a small group of uncorrupted local police. The rest of the block was cordoned off with sawhorses, and the smell of tension hung in the air. Talia surveyed the building's perimeter. She spotted armed men on the roof, near windows, at every entrance. Over her earpiece, she coordinated with a small FBI contingent that had arrived discreetly using Talia's intel. They needed to avoid a bloodbath. The criminals inside, led by Rowan and the mayor, threatened to kill any intruder, claiming they were protecting democracy from an invasion. The spin was laughable, but in the darkness, guns speak louder than reason. Talia's plan was swift and precise. Use minimal force to secure the building, gather fresh evidence, and place everyone under federal arrest. If it went sideways, hostages or innocents could die. She signaled Paxton to circle behind, infiltration style. Dina Park took a vantage point to film everything, ensuring no misdeeds stayed hidden. As midnight approached, Talia made her move. She advanced on the east side, disabling a guard with a chokehold. Paxton neutralized 2 more near a side door. They used a suppressed breaching tool on the door's lock, then slipped inside. The hallways echoed with frantic radio chatter from the mayor's men, who realized intruders were inside. A firefight erupted, bullets whining off marble floors and walls. Talia and her small unit advanced with disciplined tactics, corner by corner.
In the central chamber, the mayor cowered behind a podium, flanked by Rowan and a handful of corrupt officers. They'd pinned a group of actual city workers, forcing them to kneel at gunpoint to stage a hostage scenario. Talia's heart pounded at the sight, fury blazing. She signaled her unit. They flanked left and right. In a flash, Talia hurled a flashbang that went off with a deafening pop of light and sound. Disoriented, the criminals staggered. Talia and Paxton advanced, weapons trained, shouting for them to drop guns. Mayor Eastman fired wildly, shrieking about conspiracies. Rowan tried to drag a hostage in front of him as a human shield. Talia pressed the advantage, firing a precise shot that disarmed Rowan without killing him. Her bullet tore through his shoulder. He howled in pain, dropping the hostage. Meanwhile, Paxton pinned another officer to the floor. The others surrendered at the sight of Rowan's blood. Like that, it was over. Sirens wailed outside as the FBI rushed in, placing the entire group under arrest. Agents moved systematically, collecting weapons, reading rights. Eastman sobbed that he was set up, that none of this was real. Rowan cursed Talia by name, his face twisted in agony. Talia observed it all with icy calm, ensuring none of the criminals had a chance to destroy any last shred of evidence. News cameras captured the final scene. Colonel Talia Wallace stepping out of City Hall with the hostages safe, handing them to paramedics. The once untouchable mayor was marched out in cuffs, along with the police chief and multiple high-ranking officials. Under the glare of media lights, Talia remained stoic, refusing interviews. She only said, "Please direct all questions to the Department of Justice." That dawn, a wave of relief and celebration swept through Brackenport. People awakened to learn their top officials had been arrested for corruption, extortion, attempted murder, conspiracy. Everett, emerging from the safe apartment, felt tears sting his eyes as he watched live footage of the arrests. He prayed Talia was uninjured. Later that morning, Talia found him at the bookstore. Though battered, the shop had reopened. The boards over the windows had been replaced by temporary glass. Locals milled about, marveling at the quick turn of events. Everett greeted Talia with a fierce hug, searching her face for exhaustion or injury. She smiled, only a bit subdued. "I'm okay, Dad." He nodded, feeling relief seep into his bones. "Then it's finally over?" she exhaled. "For Brackenport's leadership, yes. But there are bigger fish above them, possibly statewide. My contacts say we'll keep digging." The next weeks became a whirlwind of federal investigations, depositions, plea bargains. Those in power who'd grown fat on bribes scrambled to cut deals, naming higher-level accomplices. The syndicate that had financed Brackenport's corruption decided to abandon the town entirely, trying to erase their footprints. But Talia's evidence was extensive. She fed it systematically to the feds, ensuring no corner was left unlit. Harrison Reed published a damning series of articles titled Brackenport Unveiled, each installment detailing a different facet of corruption and how fear had nearly strangled the town. The story gained regional attention, then national. Citizens from other places wrote letters of support, praising Everett's stand and Talia's heroism. Talia, for her part, quietly slipped out of the spotlight. She let the people take back their town. One crisp autumn morning, the new interim police chief, a once marginalized sergeant named Lynn Ramirez, with an unblemished record, stood in a modest swearing-in ceremony. Everett attended, heart swelling with pride to see Brackenport reclaiming its dignity. The ghostly hush that once clung to the streets began to lift, Locals felt safe again. Businesses that had locked their doors reopened. And Talia, she prepared to depart, her mission complete. On the final afternoon before she left, Talia and Everett sat in the back corner of the Lighthouse Bookstore. Sunbeams filtered through fresh glass windows, illuminating rows of once damaged books that volunteers had helped restore or replace. "You did it," Everett murmured, voice thick with emotion. She shook her head. "We did it, Dad. You never backed down, even when they threatened everything. That gave people courage." He cleared his throat. "I'm supposed to be the parent protecting you." She smiled gently. "You protected me my whole childhood. I learned from you how to stand up." They sat quietly for a moment, father and daughter, soldier and veteran. Everett recalled a quote he loved, something about how the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. He spoke it aloud. Talia closed her eyes, letting those words resonate. Later that evening, as Talia left for the airport in a borrowed Jeep, Everett waved goodbye, feeling a pang of loneliness, but also gratitude, because the bookstore was still here, the town he loved was healing, and the daughter he'd raised had not just survived, but thrived, carrying forth the torch of justice he'd lit in his small ways. Over the coming weeks, Brackenport underwent a thorough rebuild of its institutions. A civilian review board was formed, with Everett invited to serve. He accepted, wearing a suit to the monthly meetings, though he hated suits, as a quiet statement that an ordinary bookstore owner could hold the powerful accountable. The community was spurred to stay engaged, to never again let complacency usher in tyranny. Students from the local high school sometimes visited the Lighthouse Bookstore to interview Everett for civics projects, enthralled by the story of how corruption was toppled from within. One day, a timid teenager asked him, "Mr. Wallace, what made you finally stand up?" He looked the boy in the eye. "Because living in fear robs you of your soul, and I'd rather lose everything than lose my conviction." Word spread that Colonel Wallace's takedown of Brackenport's corruption sparked similar movements in neighboring towns. People who'd cowered under their own crooked officials suddenly found the courage to speak out. Investigations sprouted, aided by Talia's infiltration tactics. The seeds of justice began to bloom in places that had long been overshadowed by threats. Everett often closed his shop in the evenings, watching the sunset over the winding river, reflecting that sometimes all it took was one push to topple a rotten structure, one person's refusal to pay hush money, one unwavering phone call to the right ally. Months later, Everett received a letter from Talia. She was somewhere undisclosed, working another operation, dismantling another nest of criminals. The letter read simply, "Dad, remember that fear is the real enemy and knowledge is the real power. Love, Talia." Enclosed was a small photograph of Talia standing in front of a battered building in another dusty corner of the world, wearing the same unwavering determination. Everett pinned the photo on the back wall of the bookstore, near a collage of older snapshots from his time in uniform. He smiled at how the circle continued. He'd taught Talia to stand up, and she, in turn, taught entire communities to rise against bullies. Brackenport thrived. Tourists arrived, intrigued by the town that overcame corruption. The weekend market bustled again, farmers selling fresh produce, children chasing each other along the boardwalk. People greeted each other with warmth instead of wary glances. The new leadership kept watch, not letting complacency slip in again. And Everett? He continued offering books, stories, and a safe haven for hungry minds. Occasionally, locals asked him for reading recommendations, especially anything about courage or justice. He'd grin and hand over works by historical figures who refused to bow to oppression. As the seasons passed, the memory of the crisis lingered only in news archives and the scars on certain buildings, but the lessons remained powerful. Freedom, Everett realized, wasn't just won on foreign battlefields. It was defended in everyday life, in the smallest corners of one's own hometown. When Talia eventually returned for a brief visit, her hair a little shorter, her eyes a touch more haunted, she found that Brackenport had reclaimed its heart. Together, they walked along the river at dusk, father and daughter side by side. Fireflies blinked among the reeds. Talia carried herself with the quiet grace of a soldier who never truly leaves the fight behind. But her guarded face softened as she saw children laughing by the water, unafraid. "They look free," she murmured. Everett nodded. "They are. That's what you did."
She shook her head. "What we did. And I just ended one battle. Corruption pops up elsewhere. I'll go there next." He gazed at her with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You can't fight all the world's battles alone." Talia gave a half-smile. "No, but each victory sparks others. That's how the world changes." They turned back toward the bookstore, the old neon sign reading "The Lighthouse" glowing in the twilight. A handful of customers still browsed, reading in cozy chairs near a lamp. It felt like life had returned to normal, or perhaps a better version of normal. Everett squeezed Talia's hand. "Stay a while longer this time," he said softly. "We've got room for you, and the store might use your help organizing the next shipment." She chuckled. "I'd be honored, Dad. For a few days, anyway." Then her gaze slid away. "But soon I'll get a call. That's how it always goes." He accepted that truth. They parted ways that night, she to his guest room upstairs, he to lock up the shop. He turned off the lights, glancing out at the quiet street where once intimidation reigned. Now it was just a peaceful neighborhood under starlight. His heart felt full with gratitude. After he climbed to his own small bedroom, Everett spent long minutes reflecting on the philosophical lessons this ordeal had taught. Lying in bed, he considered how small actions could cascade into seismic changes. The next day, he decided he'd share these reflections should anyone ask, because that was how people learned, how they found courage. He'd say something like, "First, fear grows when we pretend we don't see evil. But once we open our eyes, fear begins to shrink." In Brackenport, folks had hoped ignoring corruption would keep them safe, but it only gave the wolves more power. Second, standing up can feel lonely, but it never is truly so. There are always others, neighbors, friends, strangers, ready to join once someone lights the spark. His refusal to pay protection had been that spark, drawing in Talia, drawing in the honest police, drawing in the entire town's hidden bravery. Third, corruption often cloaks itself in official titles and fancy suits, but it unravels when exposed. Truth is a relentless force, like sunlight dissolving shadows. The more they tried to shred documents and hush witnesses, the more glaring their guilt became. Finally, no one is too small or too old or too ordinary to make a difference. Everett, a bookstore owner, could have caved to threats. Instead, he reclaimed not just his own dignity, but the soul of his community. One person can't fix the world alone, he'd tell middle-aged readers who asked for guidance. But each of us can fix our corner, and those corners add up. Every so often, he'd spice up his advice with quotes from notable figures, lines that resonated with folks his age, a snippet from Winston Churchill about never yielding, or a nod to Martin Luther King Jr.'s words on injustice. He'd adapt them to the day-to-day reality of living in a small town that nearly lost its moral compass. Of course, no story was entirely perfect or conclusive. Months after the main arrests, rumors persisted that pockets of the old guard plotted revenge. Talia, from wherever she traveled on assignment, kept an ear out. She had no illusions that Brackenport was magically immune to corruption forever, but that hardly mattered. The point was that the people now knew how to stand. They had tasted victory over their fears, and they would not go quietly back into subjugation. A year later, Talia made another visit, strolling into the Lighthouse Bookstore unannounced. The place looked vibrant. Children gathered for a story hour. Seniors sipped coffee in a corner lounge Everett had installed. Talia marveled at the transformation. New paint, polished shelves, and expanded selection. The community had rallied around Everett, making the store a symbol of rebirth. She found Everett behind the counter, hand-cellared a memoir to a curious teen. He spotted her mid-sentence and beamed. "Talia!" The teen's eyes widened. "Oh, wow! You're Colonel Wallace, right?" Talia offered a polite nod. "Just Talia, good to meet you." After the teen left, father and daughter embraced. She noticed a framed news clipping behind the register featuring her father's determined face, a headline calling him the bookstore veteran who helped restore justice. Another clipping showed Talia in uniform, just a side mention of her role. She cleared her throat, touched by the subtle pride he displayed. They settled at the small cafe table, a hush of contentment around them. "Town's changed," Talia remarked, sipping coffee. "In a good way," Everett nodded. "People talk openly now, they keep an eye on new officials, they push for transparency. We're not perfect, but we're not asleep anymore." She smiled softly. "You look happy, Dad." "I am," he admitted, "but I owe so much to you." She shook her head. "I just came when you called, Dad. You did the heavy lifting all those years, building trust in this store, in your neighbors. It was your moral backbone that carried the day. I just had the skill set to back it up." They laughed quietly, each aware that they'd stepped beyond father-child roles into something larger, allies in the eternal fight for justice. The warmth in the bookstore was a testament that goodness, once awakened, glows like a lamp in the dark. Eventually, Talia would leave again for her next mission, and Everett would stay to anchor Brackenport's newfound integrity. But for now, in that bright mid-morning light, they savored a sense of accomplishment. For the men who once demanded hush money and those who let fear run the streets, their day had passed. The quiet victory belonged to ordinary citizens who found their voices, and to a father who'd refused to bribe bullies, and a daughter who'd learned from him how to fight for what's right. When asked by a local reporter if he regretted not paying the fee to avoid trouble, Everett gave a measured response that stuck with folks. "Regret is heavier than any price they demanded. If I'd paid them, I'd have regretted it my whole life." In time, the Lighthouse Bookstore became more than just a place to purchase novels. It was a living emblem of resilience, a testament that a single candle can chase away a roomful of darkness if held steady. Tourists dropped in not only for books but to meet the man behind the stand. Everett never turned away a question, never hid the simpler truth: "I just refuse to be bullied. Anyone can do the same if we stand together." And so life flowed on in Brackenport, shaped by an undercurrent of courage that refused to vanish. In a sense, Everett Wallace and Colonel Talia Wallace had shown that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in foreign deserts or jungles, but on the streets, where we live, against enemies wearing badges and titles instead of camouflage. And if there was one overarching lesson, it might be that justice isn't guaranteed. It's painstakingly cultivated by those who refuse to let intimidation triumph. Near closing time on a quiet Tuesday, Everett flipped the sign on the door from open to closed. He lingered at the window, gazing out at the lamplit street. A few kids rode bicycles past the bookstore, unconcerned about roving bullies or extortion. That normalcy felt precious. He let a gentle smile crease his face, recalling a line he'd often repeated to customers: "Darkness only prevails if we forget to turn on the light." And here, in this humble store, the light still shone. He walked among the shelves, trailing a hand across the spines of newly arrived books, titles of hope, of resilience, of truth. At the very back, displayed prominently, was a paperback of collected quotes from famous figures who had stood against oppression. A small sign read, "Read, reflect, resist." It was a motto Talia had teased him about, but secretly he knew she approved. At last he locked up, stepping into the mild night air. The stars above Brackenport gleamed with a sort of promise. He reflected that even if Talia was far away, championing another threatened community, her spirit remained here, encouraging each resident to stand tall. And he, Everett Wallace, just a once quiet bookstore owner, had proven that a single refusal to kneel could spark a revolution of the heart. As for final thoughts, the deeper philosophical truths glowed in his mind. He'd share them whenever someone asked how to reclaim their own corrupted town. 1. Real courage is choosing to do right despite fear. It doesn't mean you don't feel terror. It means you act for justice anyway. 2. You're never truly alone when you stand up, you just go first. Others, seeing your example, will find their own strength. 3. Documents can be shredded, but truth is tenacious. So gather evidence, let the light in, and corruption will wither. 4. Hope isn't naive optimism. It's the lifeline that keeps people fighting. Once a single spark of hope ignites, no threat can fully extinguish it. And 5. A community is only as strong as the ordinary folks who refuse to abandon principle. Your voice, your store, your stand, these small acts can topple giants. He smiled at the memory of Talia's last words before she departed. We beat them here, Dad. Others will do the same next town over. This is how the world changes, step by step. Pulling his jacket tight against a light breeze, Everett headed home, content in the knowledge that Brackenport had awakened. In the distance, a lone car hummed along, but no shadowy figures lurked, no malice clung to the corners. Peace reclaimed these streets. Tomorrow the bookstore would open again, welcoming the curious, the hopeful, and the newly emboldened. Life went on, but now it went on freed from the chains of fear. In the hush of that star-filled night, he realized that sometimes the bravest battles are the ones fought with open eyes and an unbending spine in the face of everyday tyranny. And if there's one parting gift he'd leave those who listened, it be, never forget, corruption counts on your silence. Speak up, stand firm, and you become the worst nightmare of those who crave power over honor. Some final, deeper reflections for those in midlife, or anyone longing for reassurance that standing against corruption remains worth it. People often wonder whether a single act of defiance can matter. The truth is, it can matter more than you'll ever know. Our experiences, especially once we've lived long enough to see patterns, teach us how easily communities slip into quiet acceptance of wrongdoing. Yet that same lifetime of insight also teaches us that a single no can ripple outward, inspiring others to break their own silence. Old injuries may ache, both physical and emotional, but they can also be reminders of battles survived. When Everett refused to pay the bribe, he was leveraging decades of moral fortitude. He'd once been a soldier, now he was a peaceful bookstore owner. But the principle remained. If you yield to bullies, you invite more bullying. If you resist, you plant the seeds of freedom for all who witness your stand. Such lessons transcend age. They speak to something universal. We must be guardians of each other's dignity. And yes, sometimes that means calling a daughter, a friend, or a neighbor for backup. There's no shame in enlisting help. That's how communities thrive. No man is an island, John Donne wrote. Or as others might put it, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. So perhaps the overarching philosophy is this: corruption doesn't need a million heroes to fail, just enough people with unwavering resolve to say, not here, not in my town. Then doors open, alliances form, and intimidation crumbles. It's a cycle repeated across history. And though it can be daunting, we find in ourselves the power to tilt the scales toward justice. In Brackenport, that cycle culminated in justice served, a community rejuvenated, and the knowledge that vigilance never truly ends. But people rest easier knowing they're not powerless. They are, in fact, the rightful owners of their fate, as long as they remember the simple yet profound truth. To stand up is always a choice within reach, no matter one's age or station in life. A favorite quote Everett sometimes recites to middle-aged folks seeking wisdom is, "It is never too late to be what you might have been." Attributed to George Eliot, he modifies it for the situation, "It's never too late to stand up for what you believe." Courage has no expiration date. And so the saga of the Wallace family in Brackenport echoes beyond the city limits, reminding all of us that ordinary people can and do change the world, one unflinching stand at a time.